Suzen had always been the kind of woman who craved life in its rawest form, laughter that filled a room, emotions that refused to be tamed. But lately her marriage with Nissan had started to feel like a quiet song played on repeat. The days were predictable, the nights even more so. She loved him deeply, yet something inside her whispered for more. Not another man, not an affair, but the pulse of mystery they once shared. That ache for something unspoken lingered like a secret melody in her chest. One late evening, while the rain tapped against their window, she looked at Nissan across the couch and saw the same tired comfort in his eyes. He was a good man, loyal, steady, but routine had softened his fire. And so, with her heart pounding harder than she'd expected, she spoke. Her voice was low, deliberate, carrying both fear and desire. What if we tried something different? Something to test us, to wake us up again? It wasn't a complaint. It was a spark being tossed into still water. Nissan looked at her, confused at first, then intrigued. He could tell this wasn't one of her fleeting whims. Susan's ideas always carried intention, and this one, it scared him a little. When she explained her plan, a masquerade party, full of strangers, where identities vanished and only instincts mattered, he felt his chest tighten. Her words were laced with danger, yet something in them stirred his curiosity. Was this madness, or a chance to reclaim what they'd lost? The idea hung in the air between them, fragile and electrifying. Susan's eyes gleamed with a mix of courage and vulnerability, a look Nissan hadn't seen in years. A masquerade, he repeated, testing the word on his tongue as if it might reveal her true meaning. She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her wineglass. No faces, no names, just connection, feeling, not knowing. It wasn't about betrayal, she made that clear, but about rediscovering trust in its rawest form. Could love survive behind a blindfold? For a long while, he said nothing. The clock ticked, the rain softened, and Suzen wondered if she'd gone too far. Yet beneath his hesitation, something in Nissan shifted. He saw not a wife seeking escape, but a woman craving to be seen again. Her honesty disarmed him. The woman sitting before him wasn't asking for permission. She was inviting him into her storm. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted to step into it with her. Finally, he smiled, the kind of faint, uncertain smile that hides both fear and excitement. "You really think this will bring us closer?" he asked. Suzen leaned back, her expression calm, but her heart racing. "Not closer," she whispered. "Just awake again." The word echoed softly in the room, settling between them like a promise and a dare at once. Something had already changed. The next morning felt strangely alive. Sunlight spilled through the curtains, and for the first time in months, Suzen woke up before Nissan, her mind racing with possibilities. She could almost feel the pulse of the unknown waiting for them somewhere beyond routine breakfasts and polite kisses. While she brewed their coffee, she caught her reflection in the window. The same face, the same woman, yet something inside her looked awakened. She wasn't chasing danger. She was reaching for depth, for the thrill of rediscovery. Nissan joined her at the table, still cautious, still trying to make sense of what she'd proposed. "If we do this," he began, "we set boundaries. We talk about it, everything, after." His voice carried both protection and surrender. Suzen nodded, grateful for his need to understand. Beneath his calm, she sensed the flicker of something long buried, curiosity, maybe even desire. It wasn't the plan itself that scared him, but what it might reveal about them both. As the day moved on, their unspoken agreement lingered like static in the air. They didn't touch more than usual, didn't say anything more about the masquerade, yet both could feel the quiet current running beneath every glance. The seed had been planted. Whatever was coming would test them, yes, but it might also remind them why they'd chosen each other in the first place. Days turned into quiet anticipation. Nissan tried to bury the thought of the masquerade beneath work and routine, but Susan's idea clung to him like a whisper he couldn't shake. He caught himself imagining what it would feel like. The music, the anonymity, the thrill of not knowing who was who. Part of him felt betrayed by his own curiosity. The other part? It burned to see what Suzen would become in a world without names. And so, one evening, she placed an elegant black envelope on the kitchen counter and simply said, "It came." The invitation was embossed in gold, the address handwritten in looping ink. The words, "A Night of Hidden Truths," shimmered across the card like a secret only the brave could decode. Nissan held it, feeling the weight of what they were stepping into. There were no clues about the hosts, no guest list, just a location, a time, and one rule: masks must never be removed before midnight. He looked at Suzen, who stood there calm yet trembling, as if she too realized there was no turning back. That night, as they sat together choosing masks online, the air between them shifted. Suzen gravitated toward something elegant, mysterious, a deep red mask with gold trim. Nissan picked a black one, sharp and simple, reflecting both his restraint and his uncertainty. They agreed on rules. No full names, no disappearing acts, no crossing certain lines. But as they sealed their plans with a quiet toast, they both knew the real challenge wouldn't be the masks. It would be what waited behind them. The week leading up to the event felt longer than usual, stretched by equal parts excitement and unease. Susan caught herself daydreaming while folding laundry or washing dishes, picturing the flicker of candlelight and the hum of violins she imagined filling the hall. It wasn't about strangers or temptation. It was about possibility, about feeling that pulse of life she hadn't felt since the early days with Nissan. Still, beneath her anticipation, there was a hint of fear, not of what might happen at the party, but of what it might awaken inside her. Nissan, meanwhile, battled his own storm. He told himself he was doing this for her, for them, but the truth was murkier. Every time he thought of Susan blindfolded among strangers, a spark of jealousy caught fire in his chest, and yet that same fire was laced with desire. He wanted to see her alive again, wanted to feel that hunger she'd hidden under years of routine. It was confusing, intoxicating, and deeply human. Maybe this was the edge they needed to remember who they once were. They spent one last evening together before the night of the masquerade, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Susan ironed her dress, a satin shade of midnight blue, while Nissan poured 2 glasses of wine. The clinking sound filled the silence between them, saying what neither could put into words. Tomorrow, they wouldn't be husband and wife, not in the usual sense. Tomorrow, they'd be 2 souls stripped of certainty, walking into the unknown, and somehow that thought thrilled them both. The night arrived, cloaked in elegance and tension. The city lights shimmered like scattered diamonds as their car glided through the streets. Suzen sat in silence beside Nissan, her hand resting gently on his knee, her pulse betraying her calm. When they reached the grand estate, laughter and distant music spilled from its golden doors. The mansion loomed like something out of a dream, tall, radiant, and full of secrets. Each step they took closer to that entrance felt like crossing into another world, one where promises and fears blurred into one. At the door, attendants in tailored suits greeted them, offering champagne and silent smiles. Everyone inside wore masks of every color, peacock feathers, lace, velvet, metallic golds, creating a sea of beautiful strangers. Conversations hummed in low tones, broken only by bursts of laughter or the soft rhythm of violins. The air smelled of roses and risk. Susan felt the ground shift beneath her, the thrill of anonymity crawling across her skin. Nissan, ever composed, scanned the crowd, protective, cautious, but undeniably drawn in. They exchanged a glance that said everything. We're still us, for now. Susan's heart fluttered as she adjusted her mask, her lips curving in a mix of defiance and excitement. Nissan took her hand, just for a second, before letting it go. The moment his touch left her skin, she felt both free and untethered. The night had begun, and the rules of the world they knew no longer applied. The moment Susan tied the silk blindfold around her eyes, the world shifted. Sight, that constant anchor, vanished, and in its place came a symphony of sound. She heard laughter echoing, footsteps gliding across marble, glasses clinking in soft rhythm. Every whisper, every breath seemed amplified. Her pulse matched the music's beat, steady, but wild. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. What she felt was something deeper, primal. It was surrender. For the first time in years, she wasn't performing or pleasing. She was simply feeling. Nissan watched from across the ballroom, hidden behind his mask. His heart pounded as he saw her blindfolded, radiant, and untouchable all at once. It wasn't jealousy that took hold of him now. It was awe. She looked free, more herself than she had been in a long time. Yet the thought of others brushing past her, speaking softly near her ear, made his chest tighten. He'd promised himself he wouldn't interfere, that he would let her explore this experience unshackled by his fear. But promises were easier made in daylight. As Susan stepped forward, guided by the gentle pressure of an attendant's hand, her senses sharpened. The air felt warm against her skin, the faint scent of perfume and candle wax wrapped around her. Every sound painted a picture, laughter blooming nearby, the deep timbre of a man's voice, the flutter of silk brushing her arm. She smiled, realizing that the unknown wasn't terrifying at all. It was intoxicating. She could almost hear her own courage breathing back at her, whispering, "This is what it means to be alive." Time began to melt into sensation. Susan moved slowly through the room, her fingers brushing velvet drapes, cool glass, the smoothness of marble beneath her palms. She wasn't looking for anyone, just letting instinct lead her. Each step was a heartbeat, each breath a confession. Someone's laughter came close. A man's cologne drifted past, and her skin prickled with awareness. The air itself seemed to touch her, to remind her that life still pulsed all around. This wasn't about desire for others. It was the rediscovery of her own presence in the world. From his vantage point, Nissan wrestled with a storm of emotion. He wanted to be the man guiding her hand, the voice she turned toward. Yet he also knew that if he stepped in too soon, he'd break the spell, the fragile trust they had dared to create. Watching her was both agony and beauty. Every tilt of her head, every small smile, revealed a part of Suzen he'd forgotten to look for. It was humbling to realize how much he'd stopped seeing her, even when she'd been right beside him. Somewhere in the crowd, the music softened to a gentle rhythm. Suzen lifted her chin, as if feeling it through the air, and something inside her shifted, a memory, a flicker of who she used to be. She thought of their early days, of laughter in cheap apartments and midnight promises whispered under thin blankets. This night wasn't about escaping Nissan. It was about remembering the woman she'd been before the world told her to quiet down, and perhaps finding a way to bring her back home. The orchestra swelled, and for a moment the entire room seemed to sway with the music. Someone brushed past Suzen, their shoulder grazing hers, a fleeting touch, harmless, yet charged with electricity. She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, letting the moment exist and fade. The silk blindfold made her world smaller, but somehow her spirit felt larger, freer. She could sense Nissan somewhere nearby, a presence she couldn't see but knew instinctively. In that invisible thread between them, something real was happening, something words couldn't define. Nissan, hidden behind his mask, could barely breathe. Watching her like that, unafraid, unguarded, shook him in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't the sight of her that moved him, but what she represented. Courage, vulnerability, the woman who once dared to love him so fiercely that the world felt brighter for it. He realized then that this wasn't a test of her faithfulness. It was a mirror held up to his own heart. Could he love her even when she stepped beyond his understanding? Could he trust her when he couldn't see her eyes? The song faded into silence, and Suzen turned her head slightly, sensing the shift in the air. Somewhere deep inside, she knew the night wasn't done, that this was only the beginning of what they came here to discover. The next step would ask for even more honesty, even more surrender, and though she couldn't see Nissan, she felt the weight of his gaze, steady, unspoken, waiting for what would come when the masks finally fell. When the clock neared midnight, the atmosphere inside the grand hall thickened with anticipation. The music dimmed, voices lowered to whispers, and all around Suzen, the rhythm of hearts and breath merged into one shared pulse. She could feel it, that collective moment before truth arrives. A soft chime rang out, signaling the end of disguise. Hands reached for masks. Laughter rippled through the air, but she hesitated, her blindfold still resting like a secret across her eyes. Taking it off meant more than just seeing. It meant facing what the night had changed inside her. Across the room, Nissan removed his mask slowly, his skin warm, his mind racing. The sight of her, still blindfolded, still standing calm amid the swirl of movement, stopped him cold. There was something sacred about her stillness, as if she had been transformed by the very act of letting go. He felt an ache rise in his chest, a mix of pride and longing. He hadn't realized how deeply he'd missed the sound of her quiet courage. This woman before him wasn't his possession, wasn't a mystery to solve. She was a truth to be witnessed. Suzen's fingers reached for the silk ribbon at the back of her head. She untied it gently, feeling the world flood back in through color and light. Her first sight was a sea of faces, masks gone, people laughing, crying, embracing, and then, through the crowd, Nissan. Their eyes met across the room, and it was as if everything else fell away. The music returned in a soft, tender tune, but neither of them moved. They didn't need to. In that look, the night's meaning was laid bare. It had never been about strangers at all. It had always been about them. Nissan began to walk toward her, slow and deliberate, his steps almost reverent. The crowd seemed to part naturally, sensing something sacred in their silence. Suzen felt her breath catch as he came closer, not because she feared him, but because she recognized that look in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was recognition. The same man she'd married years ago was looking at her now, as though seeing her for the first time. "You found what you were looking for?" he asked softly, his voice unsteady. She smiled faintly. "I think I found what we both forgot." They stood there, surrounded by gold light and fading laughter, saying little but feeling everything. For a moment, neither cared about the rules they had set, the boundaries they'd feared crossing. What mattered was the honesty between them, raw, wordless, and real. Suzen reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of his mask still hanging from his hand. That small gesture said more than any confession could. She wasn't apologizing, and he wasn't accusing. They were simply acknowledging the journey, the distance they'd walked to meet again. Nissan lifted her hand to his lips, his breath warm against her skin. Around them, music began to swell once more, not the teasing rhythm of earlier, but something softer, almost forgiving, the kind of melody that feels like closure and rebirth at once. "You scared me," he admitted quietly. "Good," she replied, her voice trembling. "Maybe that means we're alive again." And for the first time in a long while he laughed, not out of humor, but relief. The night had stripped them bare, and somehow they'd survived it together. The music dimmed again, replaced by the faint hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. Around them, guests drifted back into their worlds of champagne and chatter, but Suzen and Nissan stood in their quiet corner, suspended in something softer than time. She studied his face, not the familiar features of her husband, but the man behind them, the one who had followed her through fear and fire just to understand her heart again. "You were watching me," she said gently, half smiling. He nodded. "Every second, and I realized how blind I've been all this time." Her eyes softened. Maybe we both were. There was no accusation, only truth. They had spent years mistaking comfort for closeness, silence for peace. Tonight had broken that illusion, beautifully, painfully, and now there was only clarity, the kind that comes when masks fall away and what's left is unguarded and human. Nissan reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his thumb lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "So, what now?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. Suzen looked around at the glittering room, at the faces slowly returning to laughter and light. Then she turned back to him, her expression calm but alive with quiet certainty. "Now," she said, "we remember. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning disguised as one." The night had peeled away what routine had buried, and as they stood hand in hand, no longer strangers behind masks, the promise of dawn felt like something sacred waiting to be earned. Morning crept into their home quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace left behind by the night. Suzen woke first, sunlight spilling across the sheets, softening the edges of the world. For a long while, she simply watched the light move, slow, gentle, patient, before turning toward Nissan. He was still asleep, his expression unguarded, boyish even. She smiled, not from relief, but from recognition. The man beside her wasn't new, he was simply seen again. And perhaps that was the rarest form of rediscovery, seeing love not as a spark, but as an ember that still burned steady beneath time. Downstairs, the smell of coffee filled the air, a familiar scent that somehow felt renewed. Nissan joined her at the table, hair still tousled, eyes quiet but clear. They didn't speak at first. There was no need. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, warm, alive. When he finally did speak, his voice carried the weight of everything they had lived through the night before. "It feels different," he said simply. Suzen met his gaze, a slow smile forming. "It is different, because we are." They lingered over breakfast, each sip, each glance holding unspoken gratitude. The masquerade was already fading into memory, yet its echo remained, in their voices, in the way his hand brushed hers without hesitation, in the quiet certainty that they had faced something many couples never dared to. What they had done wasn't about desire or danger, it was about truth, messy, frightening, and beautiful. And though neither said it out loud, they both knew. Last night hadn't tested their marriage, it had set it free. Later that afternoon, they walked together through the small park near their home, a place they had crossed 100 times before, without really seeing it. The leaves shimmered gold under the sun, children's laughter echoed in the distance, and for the first time in years, Nissan reached for Suzen's hand without hesitation. There was no grand gesture, no declaration, just fingers interlaced, steady, familiar, real. It struck Suzen how something so simple could feel entirely new. Sometimes renewal didn't come from chaos, but from the courage to start over in the same place. As they sat on a weathered bench, Suzen rested her head on his shoulder. The silence between them held stories of fear, jealousy, rediscovery, and grace. "Do you regret it?" she asked finally, her voice barely more than a breath. Nissan's answer came after a long pause. "No, I regret waiting so long to understand you." His words sank deep, touching the space where forgiveness and love meet. She closed her eyes, letting them settle into her bones. It wasn't perfection she wanted, it was truth, and now she finally had it. A breeze rustled through the trees, scattering golden leaves at their feet. Suzen smiled faintly, remembering how the night before had felt like standing at the edge of something dangerous. Yet here they were, still side by side, stronger, softer somehow. She realized that love wasn't about knowing every detail of a person, but about choosing them again, after seeing what lies beneath the mask. And when Nissan turned and kissed her forehead, the gesture felt like both an ending and a beginning wrapped into one. That evening, the house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the wind against the windows. Suzen lit a single candle on the table, not out of habit, but as a small reminder of what they had reclaimed. Its flame flickered, warm and alive, mirroring the rhythm of her heartbeat. She thought of the blindfold, the masks, the stranger's laughter. All of it seemed distant now, like a story she had read long ago. Yet, its lesson lingered, that sometimes love needs to lose its form to remember its substance. And in that truth, she found peace. Nissan joined her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think love meant keeping things safe." She looked up at him, smiling. And now, he hesitated, then met her gaze. Now, I think it means daring to see the person you love, even when it scares you. Suzen reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. There was no grand passion, no cinematic music, just two people, sitting in the glow of quiet courage, choosing each other again. Outside, the first stars began to appear, scattered across the sky like tiny promises. Suzen leaned back, her heart calm, her spirit unburdened. What they had found wasn't the thrill of danger, but the comfort of rediscovery, the kind that grows from truth, not fantasy. As the candle burned low, she whispered to herself, almost in prayer, "We made it back." And for the first time in a long while, the words didn't sound like relief, they sounded like home.